At 2 in the morning on December 16th, 1811, something under the central United States gave way. The shaking woke people in Pittsburgh, 700 miles to the northeast. Chimneys collapsed in Cincinnati, 400 miles away. Church bells rang in Boston, 1,100 miles away. President James Madison and his wife Dolly felt it in the White House in Washington, D.C. The Mississippi River, the largest river system in North America, briefly reversed its current. Entire islands vanished beneath its surface. A new lake appeared in western Tennessee that is still there today. The region at the center of all of this had a population of a few thousand scattered frontier settlers. Most of them survived because they were living in log cabins that flexed rather than collapsed, and because there simply were not very many of them. Today, 11.6 million people live in that same region. 1.3 million of them live in Memphis. And FEMA's catastrophic earthquake scenario for a repeat of the 1811 events project's 86,000 casualties, 7.2 million people displaced, and more than $300 billion in direct losses, before the indirect economic cascade is added, which FEMA estimates may double that figure. The agency does not call this scenario a major earthquake, it calls it a catastrophe, and the city of Memphis has responded to that designation with a voluntary building retrofit program that has achieved 5% compliance. This is the story of the new Madrid Seismic Zone, the fault system that most Americans have never heard of, that sits directly beneath some of the most densely populated and least prepared cities in the country, and that has done this before. The new Madrid Seismic Zone does not sit where people expect earthquake faults to sit. It sits in the middle of the North American plate, running approximately 150 miles from northeastern Arkansas through southeastern Missouri, western Tennessee, and western Kentucky, directly beneath the Mississippi River Valley. The nearest tectonic plate boundary is more than 1,000 miles away. The fault system sits above a structure called the Reelfoot Rift, an ancient scar in the continental crust from approximately 500 million years ago, when the North American continent began to split apart and then failed to complete that separation. The rift closed, the continent held together. But the zone of weakness that the failed rift left behind did not heal. It remained, buried beneath hundreds of feet of soft Mississippi River sediment, invisible at the surface, detectable only through seismograph networks and the paleoseismic evidence preserved in the soil. Memphis sits at the southern end of the zone. Its downtown, its industrial waterfront, its northern residential neighborhoods along the Wolf River corridor, all of them are built on the thick, soft alluvial deposits that the Mississippi River has laid down over millions of years. That material matters because of what it does during an earthquake. Soft, water-saturated sediment does not simply shake when seismic waves pass through it. It amplifies the shaking, extending its duration and increasing its intensity above what the underlying bedrock alone would produce. And at sufficient shaking levels, it liquefies, temporarily transforming from a solid to a saturated flowing mass that can no longer support the structures built on top of it. During the 1811-12 earthquakes, eyewitnesses described sand blows erupting from the ground across Missouri, Arkansas, and Tennessee. Thousands of those sandblow features are still visible today as pale, sandy patches in agricultural fields, permanent evidence of how thoroughly the soil liquefied 2 centuries ago. The 3 principal earthquakes of the 1811-12 sequence were not minor events. The first, on December 16, 1811, was estimated by modern seismologists at between magnitude 7.2 and 8.2. A major aftershock followed that same morning. The second principal shock arrived on January 23, 1812. The third, on February 7, 1812, was the most widely felt of all. Estimated at up to magnitude 8.8 and described by the USGS as producing effects felt from Canada to Mexico, from the east coast of the United States to the Rocky Mountains. The accounts left by those who experienced the 1811-12 earthquakes describe events that read, at first, like fiction. The steamboat New Orleans was on its maiden voyage in December 1811, the first steamboat ever to travel the full length of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Its crew, navigating the Mississippi near the epicenter zone, moored one night to a large island. They tied their lines, went to sleep, and woke the next morning to find the island was gone. It had liquefied and sunk beneath the river. Eliza Bryan, a longtime resident of New Madrid, Missouri, wrote in an eyewitness account that the Mississippi's current ran backward for several minutes, caused by what she described as an eruption in its bed. She wrote of complete saturation of the atmosphere with sulfurous vapor, causing total darkness. John Bradbury, a British naturalist traveling by keelboat near the epicenter, described the perpendicular riverbanks on both sides of him collapsing into the water in such massive sections that they nearly sank his boat. He wrote, "All nature seemed running into chaos. Two temporary waterfalls appeared in the Mississippi as the riverbed shifted beneath the current. Island number 32 off the Tennessee shore was simply gone by morning. Island number 94, known locally as Crow's Nest Island, vanished on December 16th itself." The FEMA catastrophic planning report for a modern New Madrid earthquake does not calculate what a magnitude 8 would do to the region today. It models a magnitude 7.7, significantly smaller than the largest 1812 event. Even that conservative scenario produces projections that strain comprehension. 86,000 casualties, 715,000 buildings damaged or destroyed across 8 states, more than 15 major bridges across the Mississippi River and its tributaries rendered unusable or destroyed, 130 hospitals damaged, located in the zone of peak shaking intensity, precisely where they would be most needed, 2 million people still seeking emergency shelter 3 days after the earthquake, 7.2 million people still displaced. The Midwest has no pre-positioned earthquake response infrastructure equivalent to California's. Emergency supply chains from the coasts would need to cross a region where the major river crossings are gone. The reason the FEMA projections are so dramatically worse than comparable California earthquake scenarios comes down to a fundamental difference in the physical properties of the crust. In California and the western United States, the geology has been broken, folded, faulted, and deformed by millions of years of ongoing tectonic activity. That complex fractured crust absorbs and scatters seismic energy as it passes through, attenuating the waves relatively quickly. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake, estimated at magnitude 7.8, was felt with damaging intensity within roughly 350 miles of its epicenter. The New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 to 12 were felt more than 1,000 miles away. USGS analysis of the felt areas confirms that a comparable New Madrid earthquake affects an area approximately 20 times larger than a same magnitude California event. That is not an approximation. That is the measured difference between cracked western crust that dissipates energy and ancient, cold, dense craton crust that rings like a bell. In Memphis specifically, that shaking would arrive at the surface through the very soft alluvial sediment that defines the city's geology, amplifying the energy further, extending the shaking duration beyond what bedrock alone would produce, and liquefying the ground along the Mississippi waterfront and the Wolf River corridor that runs through the city's northern neighborhoods. And it would arrive at 25,000 unreinforced masonry buildings. Unreinforced masonry, brick construction without steel reinforcement, is one of the building types most vulnerable to earthquake shaking. It has no ability to flex laterally under seismic load. When the ground moves sideways, it fractures. The walls fail. The roof collapses. FEMA's scenario projects that 60% or more of Memphis's URM buildings could collapse or be rendered permanently uninhabitable by a major New Madrid event. The city has a retrofit program. It is voluntary. Compliance stands at approximately 5%. Those 25,000 buildings include historic downtown commercial structures, churches with heavy unreinforced facades, schools built before any seismic design standards were applied to this region, and residential brick structures in older neighborhoods throughout the city. Memphis Light, Gas, and Water has estimated that utility infrastructure losses for the state of Tennessee alone, just the utilities, could reach $15 billion in a large New Madrid event. In 1814, Missouri Territorial Governor William Clark, the same William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition, formally requested federal earthquake relief for the survivors of the 1811-12 sequence. Congress responded in 1815 with a $50,000 allocation. It was the first federal disaster relief act in United States history. At today's FEMA projections, a modern repeat of those earthquakes would require a relief effort roughly 6 million times larger. The geological record shows that the 1811-12 sequence was not a singular, unprecedented event. Paleoseismic evidence, specifically the sand blow deposits and ground deformation features preserved in the soil, has identified similar large earthquake sequences in approximately 900 AD and 1450 AD in the same fault zone. The recurrence interval for major New Madrid events appears to be somewhere between 300 and 600 years. The 1812 sequence was 213 years ago. It is not the only data point in the series. It is simply the most recent one. There are 3 signals that define the risk picture for the New Madrid Seismic Zone today. The first is the USGS probability estimate, a 25 to 40% chance of a magnitude 6.0 or larger earthquake in the next 50 years, and a 7 to 10% chance of a magnitude 7.5 or greater. In California, a 10% probability over 50 years is accepted as the scientific basis for mandatory building codes, seismic retrofit requirements, and billions of dollars in proactive infrastructure investment. In Memphis, that same probability is accepted as background information, and the retrofit program it produced is voluntary. The second is the 5% compliance figure. The city of Memphis has a building retrofit program. Buildings can be made significantly more resistant to seismic shaking through reinforcement. The evidence from California and Japan shows that retrofitted structures perform dramatically better than unreinforced ones. The technology exists. The program exists. 5% of the buildings that need it have been retrofitted. The third is the paleoseismic recurrence interval. 300 to 600 years between major events. Two similar sequences identified in 900 and 1450 AD. The last major sequence, 1811 to 12. 213 years ago. The new Madrid Seismic Zone will produce another major earthquake. The geological record is unambiguous on that point. The question that the FEMA scenario, the 5% compliance rate, and the 25,000 unreinforced masonry buildings in downtown Memphis collectively answer is, what does the city look like when it does? Subscribe to stay ahead of what's coming.